October 1943. The Pacific skies are teeming with the sound of engines, the air thick with tension. The Japanese Imperial Navy's pilots, once the terror of the skies, are confident in their superiority. Their aircraft, like the A6M-0, have been unmatched in agility, dominating the early years of the war. Today, as they prepare for another aerial engagement, the Japanese pilots laugh off their new adversaries. To them, the American aircraft are still inferior, slow, and poorly equipped. The Imperial Navy's aces have little fear as they prepare for their next confrontation, but then they see it. At first, just a distant silhouette against the sun. As it grows closer, the Japanese pilots realize that this is no ordinary American fighter. The F6F Hellcat, newly introduced and built for combat, is fast, aggressive, and, most importantly, deadly. For the first time, the laughter fades from the Japanese pilots' faces. The Hellcat is not just another aircraft. It is a force that will challenge their every assumption about American fighters. The battle for air supremacy in the Pacific is about to shift, and the Japanese pilots, once so confident in their aerial dominance, will soon find themselves outmatched by the Hellcat's power and precision. As the Hellcats dive into the fray, the Japanese pilots, who had once ruled the skies, begin to realize that the balance of power is no longer in their favor. The Hellcat isn't just another American aircraft, it's the game-changer they never expected. By 1943, the Pacific War had entered a crucial phase. The Japanese Imperial Navy had once enjoyed near-total air superiority, with the A6M-0 becoming a symbol of their dominance in the skies. The Zero, known for its unmatched agility and exceptional dog-fighting capabilities, had helped Japan secure victory after victory in the early months of the war. However, by 1943, that dominance was beginning to erode. The Allies, particularly the United States, had adapted quickly, learning from their early defeats and developing new strategies and technologies that would challenge the Japanese air superiority. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 had been a significant turning point, signaling the beginning of the shift in momentum toward the Allies. The Japanese fleet had suffered catastrophic losses, including 4 aircraft carriers, and their naval air forces were severely depleted. Though Japan still possessed formidable forces, the tide was now turning. The United States, having endured heavy losses, began to produce aircraft at a rate that Japan could not match. At the heart of this new American air power was the F6F Hellcat, developed by the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation to replace the earlier F4F Wildcat. The Hellcat was designed with lessons learned from previous combat experience, making it far more capable in a dogfight than its predecessors. Unlike the F4F Wildcat, which had been effective but somewhat underpowered, the F6F Hellcat was a much more formidable adversary. Its speed, durability, and firepower gave it a significant edge over the Japanese aircraft. The Hellcat was equipped with 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, giving it a punch that was far superior to the armament of the Zero. It also featured a rugged, durable build that allowed it to withstand more damage than the lightweight Zero, which had been notorious for its vulnerability. By 1943, the United States began to deploy the F6F Hellcat in increasing numbers, and its presence in the Pacific was becoming undeniable. The Hellcat was faster, more powerful, and more resilient than the Zero. The Americans had also improved their tactics, using coordinated attacks with more experienced pilots, fighter escorts, and dive-bombing tactics. The Japanese, who had once been able to strike with near impunity, now found themselves struggling to maintain their air dominance. The Hellcat's introduction came at a time when the Japanese Navy was already stretched thin. They had suffered significant losses in battles like Midway and Guadalcanal, and their fighter forces were being worn down by the relentless American assault. The arrival of the Hellcat was a game-changer. Its superior capabilities and tactical advantages were evident as soon as it saw combat. For the Japanese pilots, the first encounters with the Hellcat were bewildering. They had initially laughed at the new American aircraft, dismissing it as just another in a long line of inferior fighters they had encountered. But as the Hellcats began to engage with them in battle, the reality of their superiority became clear. The Japanese pilots, who had been trained to rely on the agility and speed of the Zero, suddenly found themselves up against an opponent that could match them in maneuverability, outgun them, and take far more damage than the Zeros could handle. The Hellcat was not just another American fighter. It was a direct threat to the Japanese air superiority that had once seemed unbreakable. The shift in air superiority, represented by the Hellcat's dominance, had profound strategic implications. As the U.S. Navy continued to deploy Hellcats in increasingly larger numbers, the balance of power in the Pacific was shifting away from the Japanese and toward the Allies. The Japanese Navy, unable to adapt to the new realities of aerial combat, found itself unable to mount a defense against the Hellcat and the American tactics that accompanied it. The psychological effect of the Hellcat's success in battle was also significant. For the Japanese pilots, the sudden loss of their air superiority and the inability to effectively counter the Hellcat was a hard blow to their morale. They had once seen themselves as the masters of the Pacific skies, but now they were fighting an enemy who had turned the tables on them. The Hellcat's ability to take on the Zeros, inflict heavy casualties, and emerge victorious was a blow to their sense of invincibility. For the experienced Japanese pilots, the arrival of the F6F Hellcat was nothing short of a revelation. Many of them had spent years dominating the skies in their iconic A6M Zeros, a fighter that had been considered nearly unbeatable during the early stages of the war. The Zero's agility and speed had given the Japanese a significant advantage in dogfights, allowing them to outmaneuver and destroy their enemies with relative ease. To the Japanese pilots, the Hellcat was initially dismissed as just another inferior American aircraft, another fighter that would soon fall under the might of the Zero. However, when the Hellcats first appeared in combat, the reality of their capabilities shattered the confidence of the Japanese pilots. The Hellcat's robust build, combined with its 650 caliber machine guns and its ability to absorb significant damage, meant that the Zeros' usual hit-and-run tactics were far less effective. The Japanese pilots, trained to exploit the Zeros' agility, were suddenly forced to face an adversary that could match them in speed and outgun them at close range. The Hellcats, with their heavily armed airframes and impressive endurance, could chase down Zeros in ways that the Japanese pilots had never expected. The moment of realization came quickly for many of the Japanese pilots. As the Hellcats began to engage in increasingly frequent dogfights, the Japanese pilots, who had once been the terror of the Pacific skies, began to feel the sting of defeat. The Zeros that had once danced through the air with ease were now being knocked out of the sky, one by the American Hellcats. The stunned silence that followed each encounter spoke volumes. For these aces, who had once been the pride of Japan's military, the Hellcats were a humbling force. Many of the German-trained Japanese pilots, who had long relied on their aerial superiority and the shock-and-awe tactics that had worked so effectively in the early years of the war, now found themselves overwhelmed by an adversary that adapted quickly, fought relentlessly, and was more resilient than they had anticipated. The psychological impact was immense, as these experienced pilots began to question their assumptions about the invincibility of their aircraft and their ability to hold the skies. For some of the aces, this battle was more than just a fight for air superiority. It was a fight for their own identity as elite pilots. The reality of being outclassed by the Hellcat forced them to reckon with their position in the war. Once viewed as unbeatable, the Zeros were now fighting a new breed of adversary that was no longer simply inferior in technology, but also adaptable, resilient, and highly skilled. The key to the F6F Hellcat's success was its perfect balance of firepower, durability, and adaptability. The The Japanese pilots had long dominated the skies with the A6M-0, a nimble fighter that excelled in dogfights due to its lightweight construction and remarkable agility. However, the Zero's agility came at the cost of its durability and firepower. It was a plane designed for quick strikes and evasive maneuvers, not prolonged battles. The Hellcat, on the other hand, was a different beast entirely. Designed for both long-range bomber escort and aggressive dogfighting, the Hellcat was equipped with 650 caliber machine guns, double the firepower of the Zero. The combination of these machine guns and its rugged design made the Hellcat a formidable opponent. Unlike the Zero, which was often easy to destroy if hit, the Hellcat could take considerable damage and continue flying. This durability was key in its success, as it allowed American pilots to engage the enemy with greater confidence and survive engagements that might have been fatal for other planes. The Hellcat's superior firepower allowed it to outgun the Zeros in close-range combat, where the Zero had previously excelled. The American fighter could withstand the Zero's nimble attacks and still deliver crippling firepower, bringing down the Japanese aircraft faster and more efficiently than the Japanese pilots had anticipated. In many dogfights, the Hellcat would take hits and still manage to knock out the Zeros in turn. The Japanese pilots, accustomed to overwhelming their enemies with superior speed and agility, were now facing a plane that could go toe-to-toe with them and win. Additionally, the Hellcat's design allowed it to perform well in a variety of combat situations. It was effective in long-range bomber escort missions, where it could protect bombers from enemy fighters, and it was equally devastating in dogfights, where its superior firepower and resilience allowed it to outlast and destroy the Zeros. The Japanese pilots, who had relied on their speed and agility, found themselves increasingly outclassed by the Hellcat's firepower, armor, and ability to absorb damage. The tactical implications of this shift in air combat were enormous. The introduction of the Hellcat meant that the U.S. Navy no longer had to rely on defensive maneuvers or evasive tactics to protect its bombers. The Hellcat could fight back, striking down Zeros and maintaining air superiority. The combination of American fighters and bombers meant that the U.S. was now able to challenge Japan's air dominance and begin taking the fight directly to the heart of Japan's military infrastructure. The success of the F6F Hellcat was not just a testament to technological advancements, but to the strategic foresight and leadership of U.S. Navy commanders who understood the changing dynamics of naval warfare. In the early stages of the Pacific War, the U.S. had struggled to counter Japan's air superiority, especially with the limitations of the F4F Wildcat. While the Wildcat was sturdy and dependable, it was no match for the superior agility and speed of the A6M-0. The Wildcat's shortcomings were evident in the fierce fighting at battles like Pearl Harbor and Midway, where the Zeros decimated Allied aircraft in air-to-air combat. However, the leadership of the U.S. Navy adapted to these challenges, recognizing the need for a more formidable fighter. With the development of the F6F Hellcat, U.S. naval aviation took a giant leap forward. The Hellcat was a direct response to the need for an aircraft that could engage in long-range combat, escort bombers, and decisively take on Japanese fighters. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations during the war, understood the importance of air superiority, and his leadership played a key role in the transition toward a more aggressive, offensive air strategy. The introduction of the Hellcat was not only a technological leap forward, but also a strategic pivot in the way the United States fought in the Pacific. The F6F Hellcat's operational success was a direct result of American leadership's ability to adjust to the evolving nature of aerial combat. The Navy had learned from early losses and quickly adapted its tactics, emphasizing coordination between fighter escorts and bombers. Under the direction of leaders like King and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the Hellcat became a symbol of the Navy's evolving approach to warfare. one that prioritized precision, firepower, and sustained strategic efforts over the agile dogfights that had previously defined combat in the Pacific. This new approach to air combat was grounded in the understanding that victory would not come from a single spectacular fight, but from a cumulative, methodical effort to systematically cripple Japan's military capacity. The technological advancement, represented by the F6F Hellcat, was a leap forward in the development of military aviation, influenced by lessons learned from earlier engagements. The Hellcat was a product of both necessity and innovation. As a heavy, carrier-based fighter, the Hellcat was designed to be durable, versatile, and capable of withstanding the intense demands of naval warfare. It was faster than the F4F Wildcat and more powerful than the A6M-0. Its 650 caliber machine guns were a significant improvement over the Wildcat's armament, making it far more effective in offensive combat. The Hellcat also featured more advanced avionics and improved ergonomics for the pilots, making it easier for them to engage in combat for extended periods without compromising their efficiency. One of the key technological advantages of the Hellcat was its robust build. Unlike the Zero, which was designed for speed and maneuverability at the expense of durability, the Hellcat was built to endure. It was able to absorb damage from enemy, fire, and keep flying, allowing pilots to engage in more sustained combat without the fear of their aircraft falling apart after a few hits. This was particularly important for naval fighters, which often had to operate far from their home bases, and for pilots who needed to rely on the survivability of their aircraft for long missions. This technological shift allowed the Hellcat to survive encounters with the Zeros, which were previously seen as invincible by Allied forces. The Hellcat's role in the Pacific War would have a long-lasting impact on the design of fighter aircraft in subsequent years. Its combination of speed, durability, and firepower became the template for future naval aircraft designs. The ability to strike at the heart of the enemy, survive combat, and return to base made the Hellcat an incredibly effective tool in the war. The lessons learned from the Hellcat would be applied to later aircraft like the F8F Bearcat and the F4 Phantom, reinforcing the importance of balancing offensive power with the ability to take damage and return to fight again. The Hellcat's ability to combine air superiority with ground attack capabilities also marked a shift in how multi-role aircraft would be valued in future conflicts. The concept of a fighter that could excel both in dogfights and in supporting bombing raids was fully realized with the Hellcat. Its technological advancements reshaped not only the course of the Pacific War, but also the development of fighter aircraft that would follow. The turning point in the Pacific War, as seen through the lens of aerial combat, arrived with the first real test of the F6F Hellcat's capabilities against the Japanese aces in the skies over the Solomon Islands, particularly during the Battle of Santa Cruz on October 26, 1942. The Japanese had been dominating the skies with their fast, agile A6M-0s, which had proved nearly impossible for the slower, less powerful American Wildcats to engage. But with the introduction of the F6F Hellcat, the balance began to shift. The Hellcat, as part of the U.S. Navy's new offensive strategy, represented a stark departure from the tactics and limitations of earlier American aircraft. Its robust design, superior firepower, and advanced tactical capabilities set the stage for the kind of challenge the Japanese pilots had never anticipated. In the early stages of the battle, the Hellcats went head-to-head with the Zeros, and the results were nothing short of stunning. What had initially been a fierce and confident defense from the Japanese soon crumbled under the relentless assault from the Hellcats. In their first major engagement with the Zeros, the Hellcats achieved a kill ratio of 19.1, far exceeding anything the Allies had experienced before. The Japanese pilots, experienced in the art of dogfighting, were suddenly overwhelmed by an TDB's adversary that could not only match them in speed and maneuverability, but also outgun and outlast them in ways the Zeros had never expected. The Hellcat's firepower was unmatched, and its ability to take damage and stay in the fight made it an unstoppable force in the air. For the Japanese pilots, the first encounter with the Hellcat was a devastating shock. They had been trained to fight the slower, less durable Wildcat and had dominated their engagements with ease. But the Hellcat changed the dynamics of the battle. The aggressive tactics that had served the Zeros so well for years no longer seemed sufficient. The Hellcats, working in close coordination with American bombers, delivered strike after strike on the Japanese fighters and bombers. The once feared Zeros were now struggling to keep up with the American assault, and their losses mounted. This battle marked the moment when Japanese pilots realized that they were no longer in control of the skies. The Hellcat was not just another fighter. It was the key to the shift in the Pacific's aerial landscape. The Japanese had underestimated the American ability to adapt and evolve, and they had failed to account for the overwhelming firepower and durability of the Hellcat. For the Japanese Air Forces, this defeat was not only tactical, it was psychological. The Zeros, which had once been the backbone of Japan's air superiority, were now losing to an enemy they had once regarded as inferior. The Hellcat's success at Santa Cruz, combined with its ability to operate in conjunction with other American aircraft, marked the beginning of the end of Japan's dominance in the air. It was not just a technical victory. It was a moment of profound realization for the Japanese military leadership, as they understood that they were no longer in control of the skies over the Pacific. The Hellcat, with its precision and devastating effectiveness, had shifted the balance of power. What followed in the subsequent months would only deepen this shift, with the Japanese Air Forces finding themselves unable to stop the American onslaught. In the months following the Battle of Santa Cruz, the devastating impact of the Hellcat's entry into combat would be felt in every theater of the Pacific War. The Allies, with their newfound aerial superiority, began to gain the upper hand. As the Hellcats continued to score decisive victories, the Japanese pilots found themselves facing a new reality. The Zeros, once celebrated for their speed, agility, and deadly precision, were now being systematically outclassed in the skies. The tide had truly turned. One of the key turning points came during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, sometimes referred to as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. This was the largest naval battle in history, and it would prove to be a decisive blow to Japan's hopes of regaining control of the Pacific. The U.S. Navy, now equipped with Hellcats in large numbers, was determined to finally neutralize the Japanese Navy's air forces. The Hellcats, alongside American bombers, engaged the Japanese aircraft with an intensity and precision that would leave the Japanese reeling. The battle began with the American forces launching a preemptive strike on Japanese airfields, targeting their ability to launch effective counterattacks. As the Japanese aircraft, including the once dominant Zeros, took to the skies, they were met with a formidable wall of Hellcats. The American fighters, in tight formation, launched a systematic assault, using their superior firepower, speed, and tactical coordination to break through the Japanese defenses. The Japanese, caught off guard and overwhelmed by the coordinated American assault, were quickly losing aircraft. The Hellcats, equipped with 650 caliber machine guns and far more durable than the Zeros, tore through the Japanese formations. The result was a massacre. More than 300 Japanese aircraft were lost in the battle, compared to only 30 American planes. The Hellcats played a central role in the destruction of the Japanese fleet's air forces, and for the first time in the Pacific War, Japan's air dominance was no longer a factor. The emotional toll on the Japanese pilots was devastating. These men, once considered the best in the world, now faced an enemy they could not defeat. The Zeros, which had once made quick work of their adversaries, were now outmaneuvered and outgunned by the Hellcats. The shock of seeing the American fighters not only survive but thrive in combat against their elite pilots was a turning point that shattered the morale of the Japanese Air Force. The defeat at the Philippine Sea was not just a tactical loss, it was a profound psychological blow. The Japanese pilots, who had once been trained to believe in the superiority of their aircraft, now found themselves struggling to keep up with the devastating power of the American Hellcats. In the months that followed, the Japanese Navy's air capabilities would continue to deteriorate. The Hellcats, now firmly established as the dominant force in the Pacific, continued to strike down any opposition. The Japanese would never again regain control of the skies over the Pacific, and the Hellcats' role in this transformation was pivotal. The turning point was clear. The once unassailable Japanese air superiority had been decisively broken, and the path to victory for the Allies was now open. For the American forces, this was not just a military victory, it was a defining moment in the war. The success of the Hellcat and its ability to decimate the Japanese air forces demonstrated the power of American ingenuity and the relentless spirit of the U.S. Navy. The Hellcat had proven to be not only a technological marvel, but a psychological weapon that could shatter the morale of even the most experienced and skilled pilots. The victory in the skies would provide the Allies with the air superiority necessary to support their ground operations in the Pacific and ultimately lead to the defeat of Japan. In the aftermath of the Battle of the Philippine Sea and the other key confrontations where the Hellcat had proved its dominance, the strategic landscape of the Pacific War began to shift dramatically in favor of the Allies. The loss of Japan's air superiority was a critical turning point that would reverberate through every theater of war from that point onward. The Hellcat's success in crippling the Japanese air forces was not just a tactical win, it was the beginning of the end for Japan's ability to resist the overwhelming force of the Allied military. With the loss of hundreds of aircraft, including Japan's finest aces and their once formidable Zero fighters, the Japanese Air Force was no longer a viable threat to the Allies. By mid-1944, the Japanese had been forced to concede control of the skies over the Pacific to the Americans. The Hellcat's impact was profound, as it effectively destroyed Japan's aerial defense and left them vulnerable to the unrelenting American bombing campaigns and naval assaults that would follow. For the Japanese leadership, this shift in the balance of power had far-reaching implications. The loss of air superiority meant that Japan's strategic options were severely limited. The Japanese Navy, which had once been a powerful force in the Pacific, could no longer protect its fleet from American bombers and Hellcat fighters. The once dominant naval air force was now shattered, unable to defend against the sustained Allied air assault. The inability to defend their airspace meant that Japan's war industry was now vulnerable, and the Allies could strike key military targets at will. The relentless bombardment of Japanese cities, factories, and infrastructure would continue unabated, contributing to the eventual collapse of Japan's war effort. For the American forces, the Hellcat's victory over the Zeros represented a significant moment of strategic advantage. With air superiority secured, the Allies could now focus on the critical ground operations that would bring them closer to Japan's doorstep. The Pacific theater, once defined by fierce aerial combat and the Japanese dominance in the skies, was now shifting in favor of the United States. The Hellcats, in coordination with American bombers, would continue to break down Japan's ability to fight back, clearing the way for the ground invasions that would eventually lead to the fall of Japan. The psychological effect of this shift was felt not only by the Japanese military, but by the civilian population as well. The loss of air superiority and the subsequent destruction of vital industrial targets contributed to a growing sense of hopelessness within Japan. The Japanese government, which had long relied on its military to maintain control over the people, could no longer protect its citizens from the devastating consequences of war. The American aerial assaults, once feared but now relentless and effective, left Japan's cities in ruins, further demoralizing a population already reeling from years of conflict. For the American pilots, the aftermath of their victory was bittersweet. The Hellcat's success in battle was undoubtedly a triumph of strategy and technology, but it came at a heavy cost. The battles over the Pacific had taken a toll on both sides. For the American pilots who had flown Hellcats into combat, the victory was a reminder of the brutality of war. The Hellcat had brought the Pacific Air Campaign to a turning point, but it also represented the cost of that victory. Thousands of men on both sides had given their lives in the battle for air superiority. The Hellcat's success in breaking the Japanese Air Force marked the beginning of a new phase of the war in the Pacific. With the skies now under Allied control, the U.S. Navy could proceed with more ambitious campaigns, including the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which would decisively cripple the Japanese Navy. The ability to strike from the air with impunity allowed the Allies to focus on the ground assaults that would eventually bring them closer to Japan. The loss of the Luftwaffe in Europe had been a critical moment in the war, but the loss of Japanese air superiority in the Pacific proved just as significant, heralding the final stages of the conflict. The consequences of the loss of air superiority in the Pacific were far-reaching, as Japan's strategic position continued to deteriorate. With the Hellcat's overwhelming success in the skies, the U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces could now execute operations without the threat of Japanese fighters intercepting them. The American dominance in the air was not just about the ability to destroy enemy aircraft. It was about the freedom to target Japan's critical military and industrial infrastructure without interference. This shift in the balance of power allowed the Allies to effectively cripple the Japanese war machine from the air. As the Japanese Air Force crumbled under the weight of the Hellcat's relentless attacks, their naval forces were increasingly vulnerable to air raids. The once dominant Japanese fleet, which had given the U.S. Navy a fierce challenge in the early days of the war, now found itself unable to defend against the American bombers and Hellcats. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought in October 1944, would become one of the final blows to Japan's naval power. The Hellcats played a pivotal role in protecting the Allied carriers and bombers during the battle, ensuring that the Japanese fleet, already crippled by previous defeats, was effectively neutralized. As American forces pushed closer to Japan's home islands, the strategic bombing campaigns intensified. The Hellcat's success in eliminating Japanese air superiority allowed American bombers to carry out their missions with impunity, striking deep into Japan's industrial heartland. The destruction of factories, transportation networks, and military installations severely weakened Japan's ability to continue the war. The U.S. Air Force's continued pressure from the sky, combined with the strategic blockade of Japan, choked off the country's ability to resupply its military and industrial sectors. The once proud Japanese war effort, driven by its air and naval superiority, had been reduced to a desperate, futile resistance. The psychological impact of the Allied air dominance was felt throughout Japan. As the B-29 superfortresses and Hellcats continued their relentless attacks, the civilian population faced the horrors of total war. Japan's cities, once centers of industry and military power, were reduced to rubble by the Allied bombing campaigns. The most significant of these was the bombing of Tokyo, which, along with other major cities, was devastated by firebombing raids. The loss of air superiority, coupled with the growing destruction of Japan's infrastructure, created an environment where the Japanese leadership had little choice but to face the inevitable. For the Japanese military, the aftermath of losing control of the skies was devastating. Once considered the superior naval and air force in the Pacific, Japan now faced a situation where its remaining aircraft were either too outdated or too few in number to make any significant impact. The pilots who had once soared confidently in their Zeros and other fighters were now fighting a losing battle against American bombers, which could strike anywhere in Japan without fear of retaliation. The Luftwaffe's defeat in Europe had been a critical moment, but Japan's loss of air superiority in the Pacific was equally transformative, signaling the end of Japan's capacity to challenge the United States in the air. The final days of the war would see the culmination of this shift in power. With Japan's air forces broken and its military resources dwindling, the Allies could now launch a final assault on Japan's home islands. The Hellcats and other American fighters would continue to play a critical role in the final phases of the Pacific campaign. The Japanese had been outmatched not just by the technology of the Hellcat, but by the sheer might of the Allied forces and their unwavering determination to see the war through to its conclusion. For the American forces, the Hellcat's success in the Pacific was a symbol of their adaptability and resilience. The victory over the Japanese air forces marked a decisive moment in the war, and the Hellcat's role in securing air superiority would have lasting effects on the future of aerial combat. The success of the F6F Hellcat and the victories that followed were a testament to the importance of technological advancement, strategic thinking, and the collective effort of the U.S. military. By the end of 1945, Japan had surrendered, and the war in the Pacific was over. The Hellcat had played a crucial role in achieving Allied victory, and its legacy would live on in the history of aviation. The aircraft's ability to turn the tide of the war, its combination of firepower, durability, and adaptability, marked a turning point in the Pacific. The defeat of the Japanese air forces and the eventual collapse of the Imperial Japanese Navy signaled the end of one of the most destructive conflicts in human history. The Hellcat, in many ways, was more than just a fighter. It was a symbol of the shift in global power and the ultimate triumph of Allied forces over the Axis. The story of the F6F Hellcat is more than just the tale of a remarkable aircraft. It is a story of transformation, both on the battlefield and within the minds of those who fought in the skies of the Pacific. The Hellcat's arrival in 1943 marked the beginning of the end for Japan's air superiority, and with it, the narrative of the Pacific War shifted. In the face of overwhelming odds, the Hellcat represented the Allies' resilience, their adaptability, and their technological prowess. For the Japanese pilots, the sight of the Hellcat in combat was a brutal awakening. Once confident in their dominance, the Japanese Imperial Navy's aces now found themselves up against an adversary they could neither outmaneuver nor outgun. The Hellcat's firepower, endurance, and tactical superiority turned the tables on the Japanese, and the once imposing Zero was now outclassed in every engagement. For these pilots, who had once ruled the Pacific skies, the shift in power was more than just a military defeat. It was a psychological blow. The very thing that had defined their identity, air superiority, was slipping through their fingers. For the American pilots, the Hellcat was a symbol of hope and a weapon of overwhelming force. It was the realization of lessons learned from the brutal early years of the war, when they had been outmatched by the Japanese. The Hellcat, with its heavy armament, rugged design, and the ability to absorb damage, became the ultimate tool for taking the fight to the heart of Japan's military machine. The American pilots, who had faced tremendous losses early in the war, now flew with the confidence that the Hellcat would carry them to victory. The success of the Hellcat also spoke to the changing nature of warfare. The days of dogfights, where agility and speed were paramount, gave way to a new era where firepower, resilience, and coordinated tactics determined the outcome of battles. The Hellcat, capable of sustaining heavy damage and continuing to fight, was a reflection of this shift, a testament to the power of industrial might and technological innovation. As the war progressed, the Hellcat's victories signaled that the Allies were no longer just fighting for survival, but were now fighting for total victory. In the broader context of World War II, the Hellcat was emblematic of the changing tides. The destruction of the Japanese air forces, followed by the crippling of Japan's industrial infrastructure through sustained bombing raids, marked the gradual unraveling of the Axis powers. The Pacific theater was no longer a contest of agility and speed, but one of endurance, firepower, and strategic superiority. The Hellcat's victory was not just a military triumph, it was a statement that, through perseverance and adaptation, the Allied forces had achieved air dominance, securing the skies for the final push into Japan's home islands. The aftermath of the Hellcat's rise to prominence was profound. For Japan, the loss of their air superiority was not just a tactical failure, it was a sign that their war effort was faltering. The Hellcat had proven that the tides of war could shift, and that no matter how superior a force may appear, innovation, strategy, and adaptability could overcome even the most formidable adversaries. For the U.S., the Hellcat became a symbol of the Allied victory in the Pacific. It was not the sole reason for Japan's defeat, but it was a pivotal factor in dismantling Japan's air power and paving the way for the final assault that would bring an end to the war. In the end, the F6F Hellcat wasn't just a victory for the U.S. Navy. It was a victory for technological evolution, tactical ingenuity, and the determination to never give up no matter the odds. It is a testament to the power of innovation in shaping the outcome of history and serves as a reminder that the true strength of a nation lies not only in its military might, but in its ability to adapt, learn, and ultimately triumph in the face of adversity.